Hi, welcome back to another edition of interviews for the Midwest Fantasy Sampler. Today, Tiffany Nickel has been kind enough to volunteer to interview me to discuss my contribution to the work Fairy Harvest. Hi, Tiffany.
Hi, Justin. Thanks for allowing me to dig into your story before us authors even got the the official book and everything, the ebook version.
Thanks for doing it. It was either this or I was going to record myself asking and then answering questions and do like an Instagram reel style, but that just felt like too much work.
Oh my God, now I regret saying yes, because that would have been awesome to see. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, maybe you need to do it anyway, because I think that would be pretty funny. So with Fairy Harvest, you have a very lyrical, I feel, style of writing in terms of like your prose and the voice and tonality you use throughout your story, which I really enjoy. I could tell. Did you read a lot of like classics growing up, like Ernest Hemingway and oh my God, every classic just left my ear like head here. Did you read like Jane Austen and Virginia Woolf and all of that?
Not Virginia Woolf, but the other ones, yes. Like that's definitely my main diet growing up. The ones I always say inspired my writing style were The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray, and Dandelion Wine by Ray Bradbury. Those three kind of like crafted my sense of prose. And later in life, I found other authors like Khaled Hosseini and Leif Enger, who both also have absolutely beautiful prose. I would say that those kind of craft my sense of how I craft sentences and structures. And I'd say that's also my favorite part of writing. It's the thing that I find most important in my work. You know, a lot of people go plot, character, or something like that. I'd say the prose comes first for me, then character. And then plot is kind of like ninth or something.
You're like, at the way end, it'll come together as I write it. I love that. I'm a big pantser myself. So the plot, I mean, I have like an idea of what all needs to happen, especially in a series. You kind of need to know how all the things conjoin together. But I'm definitely like a plot is something that changes very dramatically from my first idea to the end of the final draft. What about you? What about like your structurizing with the plot coming last or like ninth or whatever it is? How do you, with the series, how do you kind of connect everything and have a world be cohesive with a plot that isn't centralized?
So it's varied with each book I've written how much of the plot I know ahead of time. So my first novel, I had a beginning, an end, and like 4 or 5 emotional beats that I needed scattered throughout in mind when I started writing the novel. And then I just started writing scenes that were important to the structure. And as I wrote different scenes, they'd kind of like leak out to either side and fill in the plot on either side of them. And after I had a few of those primary scenes in, I was able to start at the beginning and write through knowing the plot because I had enough context from each of the scenes already written to know what I needed to structure it around. The second book I wrote, I plotted out a little more heavily. I kind of had like basic idea for each of the steps. Okay. And then the third one I wrote was plotted out to the point of I had every scene. Like I had chapter, I had scene, it was almost down to the page. It was so thoroughly plotted out. And when I wrote that one, it was the fastest thing I ever wrote and the easiest thing I ever wrote. And it's my favorite book. But writing the plot that way was so taxing and so frustrating to not be able to engage with the prose, to not be able to pull emotion from how things were unfolding, but rather to have to put it all down in kind of like very bare bones, basic imagery. I hated it so much that I've kind of pulled back to a little more pantsing at this point.
Yeah. I was like, that sounds so intense. I was like, that would be my worst nightmare. And I say that as I'm writing my, like finalizing my book 4, which is exactly that for me. It was the one that I had to keep tearing into because it just, I couldn't write it because just too much was happening that I had to, hey, he's deciding to try to open one of my Amazon boxes. No, child.
I didn't realize it was a 3-person interview.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Bon Jovi, don't do it. You might need to edit this out.
You're good.
You don't need to stop, little boy. All right, come here.
There we go.
So book 4 is a nightmare for me because I had to just continue to get deeper and deeper into the plot and outlining it. Do you feel happier now that you've kind of rolled back just a bit into the pantsing versus, or do you feel like now that you know how efficient outline writing does, do you still try to get closer to that?
It's a constant struggle because let's say like the 4th project I wrote was not that long of a novel, and pantsing it worked well. I just needed to have like the next 3 chapters laid out for me, and I was able to very, very smoothly go through it and write it. But then the project I'm working on now is vastly larger than anything else I've done. So it's got like about 11 different point of view characters. And I wrote 140,000 words and then realized I was a third of the way through and I needed to hack it apart into multiple novels.
Yeah.
And that one, it's like I started off pantsing it, and now I'm realizing that was a horrible decision because this thing is so large. It covers massive amounts of territory, massive amounts of time, with different point of view characters in very different locales following very different plot threads. And it's like, this is where plotting would have come in so handy. And at this point, my writing process has ground down to a crawl because of the pantsing. So it varies from project to project. You know, you kind of learn as you go what's best for what type of work.
That's very true. I actually outline my short stories a lot more than I do my big projects, but that's because I struggle with short stories more so. He's trying to get my fingies. Than, you know, my big stuff, because it's like playing D&D. It's open world versus, you know, like a video game. Where,
it's like when you're writing a short story, everything's so much smaller that it comes with the same problems that working on something very small physically comes with. You know, like when you're working on a very, very micro project and you have to position each tiny element just right to work. Whereas with something larger, you have more room to like bend and manipulate parts. Whatever you're building, you know, there's more room and flexibility. You have more choices. When you're working on a short story, everything's self-contained. You have to hit every single emotional point much faster, and you have to justify its existence with a much narrower margin of error. And so it's all the same difficulties that come with working with something very small in person happens when you're writing a short story.
Yeah.
So I can understand where plotting would come in handy because you're planning out each one of those little elements ahead of time.
Little things, yeah. So in Fairy Harvest, there's a lot of emotion that is in. It's very interpersonal, which is the type of story I love. Especially there's a lot of like emotional vulnerability around like Garrick's character. As a writer, how do you approach writing those more emotional or like intensive characters like Garrick, where there's a lot weighing on him and life is changing abruptly? How do you approach that?
I'd say I've always been a fairly empathetic person. It's always been fairly easy for me to relate to the emotions of others. So that's never been a particular challenge that I've needed to overly think about in my writing. Like there are things that I struggle with in my writing where I have to sit down and process each element of what I'm doing and go, okay, how can I do this most effectively? And how is my own personality kind of conflicting with it? But when it comes to the emotional beats, those have never been the hard thing. So as far as writing Garrick's personal struggles, there's a fair bit of me in that character also, which helps. There's a fair bit of me in a lot of my characters. And
we're all guilty.
I often say the way I construct my characters is I'll isolate little elements of what I understand of my own psyche and kind of like extrapolate them into characters who are kind of like built around that element.
Yeah.
So with Garrick, there's a lot of resentment there. There's a lot of frustration, but there's also an underlining need to meet the responsibilities that life's meted to him. And so I just kind of like looked at that sense of that work ethic, that sense of duty, and like, okay, I'm going to spin a character around this element and just kind of extrapolate it forth and make a character who's really based on that. And that's kind of I don't know. That's how I do a lot of the characters. Is I pick that one little element, and I'm like, okay, let this motivate him, let this drive him, and now I'll have all the circumstances in the story kind of like ping off of that one element, and then as they ping off and pull away, they're pulling little threads of him with them, and that's building out his character.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think a lot of authors tend to hesitate when talking about characters reflecting pieces or parts of themselves because it's very vulnerable. But writing in general is probably one of the most vulnerable things to do, because it is your consciousness being streamlined into a shareable format, essentially, with just some conscious choices around deciding the best bonbon, I swear to God, the best choice of prose or plot point to express that said emotion.
Something I always like to say is that language is kind of sacred. It's the closest we've ever come to a way to communicate what's inside one soul to what's inside another soul. And so when you write, you're kind of like using the most personal art form in my mind, because it's the closest thing we have to direct communion between internal psyches. You know, like we can never really understand exactly what another person's thinking, but language is the closest humans have ever come, you know, verbalized language. So when you write, that's the most basic art form, you know, like you can abstract a lot more when you're painting or when you're sculpting or doing these other physical things. You can pour all kinds of yourself into them, but you can also abstract a little more and distance yourself a little more. With writing, it's a little harder. You can still do it. You can still, you know, fake it and put fake things in there intentionally, but it's a lot more raw of a form.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you in terms of that. And in my author's notes, I typically talk about the very specific emotion or trauma that I'm dealing through with writing whatever story. With something we were talking about just before, your writing style, speaking of like really interpersonal and taking some of like your life and putting it into your characters, was some of the underlying tones and purpose of the story, right? Like the overarching meaning that takes place as you're reading, which is kind of a lot to deal with sacrifice, you know, obligation and expectations overriding someone's dream or idealistic lifestyle due to that, and more so also that, you know, experience kind of kills the kid or the innocence in all of us as we grow up and as we experience the difficulties of the world in which we all live in. Do you want to talk a little bit about what it's like to write that and kind of what the overarching of Fairy Harvest really means to you in terms of that?
Yeah. So Fairy Harvest is very closely related to my first novel, Ariel's Tear. They both deal very closely with the fairy folk. They both deal with the battle between innocence and knowledge. You know, in so many myths and religions in the world, you know, primarily Christianity is the main example. When humans fell, it was by gaining knowledge. You know, the reception of knowledge is the same as the abnegation of innocence. And that's always been a theme that stuck with me heavily. You know, I used to read a lot of Joseph Campbell and these different people who wrote a lot on mythology, and reading all these older texts and stuff about different myths and religions that have existed in the world. That's like a constant psychological truth that's interwoven in many of them, is the fact that the more knowledge you gain, the further you drift from that childlike wonder. And so that was a theme that was important to both my first short story, Ariel's Tear, which I wrote I wrote that initially when I was 15. I've rewritten it actually several times since then to like get the prose better over the years. But I wrote that one when I was 15. I wrote my first novel when I was 22, which I've also rewritten at this point. But anyway, those were the ages at which I initially wrote them. And when I was a kid, I lost multiple family members to suicide. And not direct family members, like they were relations. And that made a really deep impact on me as a child. Like those were moments, they were turning points when I gained knowledge and I lost innocence.
Right.
And all throughout the time I was in college, I wrote multiple different personal essays and kind of abstract fiction pieces that were just representations of the idea of going to a marketplace, carrying your innocence as the money or the goods you have to trade, and then exchanging them for knowledge about the world that will protect you and shield you as you get older. So it's like essentially you're bartering away little bits of that child in order to become a fully functioning adult.
Mm.
And so that was kind of a really central theme to Fairy Harvest, was wrestling with that idea of, okay, how do you protect the child while still becoming an adult? Can you protect the child while still becoming an adult? And how much of each should you keep? Fairy Harvest takes a bit of a more positive spin on keeping the child, whereas Ariel's Tear, it might seem that way on the surface, but if you read the novel and think a little bit about what it actually means for these children to become fairies as they do, it's kind of a dark and threatening thing. And the unnatural preservation of innocence, while seen as a wondrous thing in a way, is also, there's also a hidden darkness and edge to it that I don't want to get too much into describing because it's left fairly open, but you are supposed to come away from it saying, well, is that actually innocent anymore if you've artificially preserved it, if you have these bastions built up around it taking all the damage of the world?
Mm-hmm.
Even if what's inside is kept innocent, is the keeping of it an innocent action?
Right.
So yeah.
As authors, we often have a really difficult task of talking about these really harsh realities of life and these conundrums and philosophies, and taking that and putting that into writing that's digestible for other people. Right now, there's work out there, like A Little Life. Absolute turmoil is that book, and it's so beautiful because it does exactly what it's supposed to. But we often have to take those stories, especially in a fantasy setting, to make it a little bit more digestible for readers. What would you say is like your take to take something really emotional like that and put it into a setting that's a little more digestible and separated, so people don't feel like they're constantly having to rehash their own struggles and trauma while reading it, while also still trying to get that point across? And what advice would you give to other writers who are trying to write that more interpersonal story, without it being solely focused on just the trauma?
Sure. I think a really good example of that is Mitch Albom. I've read all of his books, which isn't saying much because they're all very short, but I have loved each one of his books I've read. He has The 5 People You Meet in Heaven, and oh my goodness, the Timekeeper is the other one that I'm thinking of. And he writes these stories about things that are actually fairly dark at their base level. The things that the characters undergo involve like war crimes and horrible post-traumatic stress disorder and different things like that, and being imprisoned in a cave for thousands of years as penalty for daring to create a clock as the first human. Like it's these things that are, if you actually think about them, they're fairly dark, they're fairly traumatic. But he writes about them in a gentle way and a warm way that allows moments of like really beautiful compassion to bleed through and saturate the story to the point where you come away more with senses of sympathy and empathy than you do with senses of horror.
Right.
And he has his own ways of doing that in his writing. He writes in a very basic, simple prose, and he lets a lot of the darker elements kind of linger in the subtext. And that's kind of his approach to it. I would say the way that I tend to do it is through my genre. Fantasy allows you to have certain shortcuts to themes. Each one of my races in my stories is created by a particular deity who is based upon a certain passion. So the Minotaurs were created by the deity Endurance. The Elves were created by the deity Philia, which is Greek for brotherly love. The humans were created by Curiosity. And because I have that hard baked into the mythology of the story, I can immediately access certain themes. You can expect the Minotaurs to be a bit stoic because they're built by Endurance. And I don't have to explain that. I don't have to world build around it. You just get it.
Yeah.
And I use those shortcuts. The fairies were created by the goddess of innocence. So you kind of get immediately an inkling of what they're about and what they're like. And so having those shortcuts lets me access the themes very readily. And I don't have to spend a bunch of time yakking on like I currently am about, okay, these creatures are innocent. You get that? They're innocent. I don't have to delve into the weeds with it. I just let the plot beats speak for themselves while the mythology behind it tells you what it's about. So
yeah, absolutely. I'm with you there. Fantasy is a beautiful shortcut in itself to write really traumatized characters and horrifying plot, but in a setting where you're like, it's fantasy though.
And that's what being an author is all about, traumatizing your characters.
Exactly.
That's it.
If you're not aiming to kill your characters, do you even care about them?
Yeah.
No, not at all. And so this kind of is like a good segue actually into the next question I had for you, which is, do you believe stories should comfort readers, challenge them, or both?
Either, both, depends on the story.
Yeah.
I mean, like if you're in a place where you're hurting and you read something that brings you comfort, that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And if you're at a place in your life where you're extremely comfortable and you read something that's challenging and that allows you to strengthen yourself via another fictional struggle rather than your own, that's also a beautiful thing. I think that as long as the story is making you feel and expanding your human experience in some way, I think it's good. And that can be in so many different ways. And horror writers do it one way.
Yeah.
Cozy romance authors do it a very, very different way. But there's a real value to both of those things. There's a real value to being able to be shocked by the horrors of the world in the abstract rather than only being bludgeoned by them in person, up personal. That's why a lot of people enjoy horror so much. You go there to experience the horror of the world without enduring the horror of the world. And then people can go to cozy romance and feel something sweet and warm and empathetic, and they can be filled with a genuine love of humanity. And that's also a positive thing.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I think a part of being a writer is finding a balance between those two things of how to challenge a reader within your story while trying to also bring them some sort of comfort to that challenge. There has to be not necessarily a resolute happy ending, right? You don't need that and they all lived, type of resolution at the end of the story to provide comfort. But sometimes even in death or even in pain and struggle, there's other ways to see, one, I'm not alone. Two, they're able to reassemble something that they lost. It may not be you can't always replace what's gone, and you can't always get back parts of you that die during, very traumatic events that happen in your life. And sometimes you change completely as a person. And I think we've all experienced little parts of those type of themes, right? And as you read a story, you can identify and see that. And I think it's really up to the reader in that moment as well to be like, how does this challenge me and how does it comfort me? Because some people who have read my stuff has said that, this part was so heartbreaking. It nearly shattered my soul and spirit. But then another part where I would have been more heart-stricken was the part that brought them comfort. And I'm like, oh, you're weird. But it was reversed for me. But the thing is that's the point of it, right? Is as long as they feel they can get maybe both the comfort and a challenge out of that story, I feel like what all of us writers are really trying to achieve in terms of our storytelling is just the magical balance of both.
There's a book that changed my perspective on reading more than anything else I've ever come across, and it's called Poetry as Survival. It's by a professor named Gregory Orr, who underwent an absolutely horrific thing as a child. Just, something that could very easily destroy a person forever.
Right.
And what he found was poetry. He found that writing poetry allowed him to order his thoughts because he had to assemble them artfully.
Yeah.
And because he had to assemble them artfully and there were rules and boundaries on how he was expressing them, it allowed him to break them down, compartmentalize them, and restructure them on the page. And he found that he could process his grief via poetry. And that's something he makes the case that poets have always done. That has always been a deeply ingrained part of poetry, is using these ordering methods, taking these laws and bounding boxes, and then spilling our inner chaos into them, and using the guidelines of the bounding box to structure our chaos and make peace with what's inside ourselves. And I think that's a huge part of the creative process. And I think it's also part of the reading process. Part of the reading process is seeing our own chaos, which, it might not be the exact same as the authors, but there's going to be overlap. There's going to be elements of the same spillage that happens in all human psyches. And as we read their ordered chaos, we're able to find little patterns for our own chaos, and we're able to order our own thoughts through reading. So yeah, that book I would recommend to anybody who enjoys art or writing or reading. I would recommend that book as a way to deepen how you view it.
Yeah, no, I think that is very beautiful. And if he took the Enneagram test, he would 100% be a 5. Which
it's been a while. I think I was, I don't want to say because I don't remember for sure. I think I was a decaying 5. Like it's like a 5 decaying into something else, but I don't remember.
Like a 5 with a wing 4?
Sounds right.
Yeah.
But then again, it might just as easily have been a 4 wing 5. So I'm not going to say for sure.
Yeah. I'm a 5 wing 4, so that would be crazy because we also we write very interpersonal stories that deal with a lot of trauma from our own lives. That would be very funny, not coincidental.
I'll have to look that up again after. I'll let you know.
You need to, absolutely. But poetry was where I started. Was exactly that. I had a really hard time with my emotions feel dangerous. Right. And they don't feel safe in the head. And to be able to put that onto paper where it's structured and I have a limit of words and understanding of this is the box that I need to fill, it became a much safer emotion to feel. So I think that's very beautiful. And on to a lighter note, if you could really sit down and talk with any of your characters, whether it's in Fairy Harvest or any of the work that you've done before, who would be your person to interview? Like, who would be like, let's go get a cup of coffee and just talk? Because I
feel like I should have thought of an answer to this before, but I'm struggling. Most of them would hate me. I've done mean things to them.
Okay, they don't know you're their creator.
Oh, okay, sweet.
Yeah,
then I just feel weird and guilty, like, oh my goodness, what have I done to this person? And I'm just sitting here with them. I feel, I'm terrible. They seem nice.
I just take the whole I think of it like if I were to meet this person, right, and like get to know them as like a stranger on the street type thing, like we were forced scenario, like you're sitting next to each other on an airplane for like 15 hours, that type of that meeting. I fantasize about it a lot of like how I would talk to my characters and like questions I'd ask about their life, about how they feel about it. Like seriously, of
sure.
like
I think I've thought of an answer. So interestingly enough, it's probably the main character in this short story, not in my novels. Because I have a trilogy planned out that I will write probably like many years from now. It's a distant project. But I'm actually going to resurrect a lot of the characters from my short stories to become the protagonists of that eventual trilogy.
Oh, wow.
And the person that Garrick becomes after Fairy Harvest, the person he is in that eventual trilogy, is somebody I would probably get along with pretty well.
Yeah.
Like, I like the emotional place he winds up in as an adult. Because in Fairy Harvest, he's still like late teens or so. And in the trilogy he'll eventually be a part of, he's more in his 30s. And I think I'd get on well with the person he becomes. Like, a lot of the characters in my main novels are deeply troubled, tormented souls.
Yeah.
And I would just feel bad for all the misery I've put them through. But Garrick, at the start of that trilogy, won't have gone through much of that yet. And he'll be a nice guy who I would get on with.
There you go. Yeah. I'm now thinking about what character would hate me. like what one would I know that if I met this person, they would be like, I could kill you. Like, I just really hope you die. And not like a villain. I mean, like one of the like protagonistic or morally gray characters in the story that everyone loves. I think for me it would be Cage, which is very funny because he's probably my most thought out character and most well written out of everyone in the series. He's not even a main character, but he's one that
they never are.
Yeah, he is something of my subconsciousness that I think I probably want to kill myself, and that's why he'd kill me. He'd be like, yeah, no, we need to terminate this chick. So now I need to know what character would hate you the most, because you said hate, and I was like, oh, what character? Like, I'm sure there's more. There's definitely more than that, but Cage definitely stuck out for me.
Yeah, probably Belisari is the name of the character. My second and third novels, my first Immortals series, each have twin protagonists.
Mm-hmm.
And basically the way it works is the first book, Ariel's Tear, introduces you to this family, father, wife,
Mm-hmm.
2 sons, and a daughter. And the father is kind of the main character of the first book. And then the next 2 books each star one of the sons and a secondary character named Belisari. And so in the first book, Belisari is introduced as a fairly naive, socially maldeveloped, but morally decent person. And he goes through a lot over the course of the 2 books. He undergoes a whole hero's journey, but he never integrates the final 13th step of the hero's journey and never becomes a master of 2 worlds because he refuses to accept the sacrifice he made. And it twists him in ways that very much change who he is. And he's a much darker presence in the second book, where he's a main character with the second brother. And in that book, he goes through a lot of very unfortunate things that would leave him very much not happy with me as his creator. So.
He'd be like, I hate you so much. All of my characters would hate me. If they knew I was their creator, they'd be like, you're sadistic. Man. Okay. So we both create worlds, right? Like very complex world building that goes involved with that. So this is like a 6-part question. So get ready. I'll ask them one at a time because each could like have its own little, moment. But the first one is with world building. How do you approach it when you're constructing a world? Even as a pantser for myself, my world building probably was the most plotted thing in existence of my life, spending 5 years delving into thousands of years worth of history, right?
Yeah.
And I never recommend that to anyone. But how do you approach your world building for a series like this, or just in general for even like a one-off story or short story even?
Sure. So for my main world that I work in the most, that I play in with all my novels and the audio drama, I started with the mythology. That was the most important thing to me because that kind of set the tone and flavor of it.
Yeah.
The earliest inspiration came from a song which was made from a poem by W.B. Yeats. So it's a song by Lorena McKennitt singing a poem by W.B. Yeats called The Stolen Child.
Okay.
And it's about changeling children, but it has a much, much kinder connotation than that myth usually has. One of the lines is, "Come away, O human child, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand." And that was the initial idea for where my fairies came from. They're the children who are too frail to handle the brutality of life, the children who wouldn't make it through the exchange of innocence for knowledge. And they're kind of taken away to this like secluded magical fairy city where they can exist as youth forever.
I'm jealous.
So that was the earliest that was the earliest inspiration for it. And so I wrote the short story Fairy Harvest from that, and it was fairly isolated at that point. And then I started building a mythology for that world. And I used Gnosticism as the basis for my creation. Okay, spirit is pure, flesh is impure, so therefore a spirit god could never create impure flesh. So he created a lesser spirit who created a lesser spirit. That's the idea of Gnosticism. I was like, okay, that's interesting, that graduated distance between the all creative God and the fleshly folk. So I said, okay, I have my main god, Phaedra. He creates a bunch of deities based upon his own characteristics. So like I said earlier, endurance, mercy, anger, curiosity, philia, all these different things. And then from that, they create the flesh folk on Earth. I was like, okay, I also really like the idea of dualism. So I created a feminine counterpart to the masculine Phaedra. You have Phaedra and you have the void. And the void is the inactive half of deity in the present world. And as Phaedra is creating time, he's spilling out threads of himself and unwinding himself to create time. And as he unwinds himself, it winds into the void, so that in the spirit world, the void becomes the active deity half and Phaedra becomes the passive half. And it's kind of like this revolving wheel of time, to steal somebody else's notion, where you have constant duality of Phaedra, active, fleshly world, the void, active, spirit world, and reincarnating into two separate threads of time. So,
where they have like the mechanic that's turning everything, but then the two spools that keep it straight and in timely order. Yeah,
exactly. So that's where I started with. I started with mythology, and once I had all my mythology built out, creating the races was a spillover from that, because I had the deity of curiosity to create man, because that's always what I thought was man's strongest trait, the urge to explore, to venture forth, to find the unknown, sailing across the ocean to find North America, going to the moon, these different, it's always the unpushed frontiers that we always constantly have to press against and discover. So, and then I was like, okay, I want to create Minotaurs. They're originally from Greek myths, so I'll give them a hint of stoicism as a nod to their Grecian origin, and I'll make them isolated democratic city-states as a nod to Athens, and so I just let the nature of the deities who created the Minotaurs, endurance, and just kind of spill over and take some real-world influences like the Greeks. Or if I wanted to make my elves, I borrow a bit from Eurasian steppe tribes.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Real world is a lot of world building, I feel. And the best world builders out there, I feel, actually do take examples of what our life is like to create such a realistic world in terms of the conflicts, right? Because I feel like that's where a lot of writing goes off in world building is having realistic historic conflicts that have taken place even before the actual events. That would
what George R. R. Martin is so good at.
So freaking good.
Creating a prehistory for the generations prior to his story that inform the current story. He does that like nobody else I've ever seen, and that's I think a masterful skill.
Yeah, it is insane, and I mean he pulls a lot of even what the current events are based off of real history. Like he could be a historian if he isn't actually a historian. I think he could be, but I with creating those conflicts of like in the past, how do you feel? Do you take a lot of conflicts that you've seen in the real world, or do you come up with something entirely of its own?
So I have not borrowed too much from the real world for my conflicts. No, they're kind of more situation specific. For individual battles and the way things unfold, I'll borrow elements. I'll certainly kind of look at numbers or how different armaments affect things and stuff like that to make it more realistic. But as far as actual like political motivations and such behind conflicts, it's pretty individual.
Yeah, I think that's the important part, is what you said, is the realistic portions of it, which is like army size and rankings and all of that stuff. Because I am not that person of like, I'm not a military person. I don't know the ins and outs of a government structure. You know, I can learn about it though. And I can use that
just long enough to get it out on the paper, and then it just leaks out again, and you have to look it up for the next book.
Exactly. Yeah, I did never stay. I say that my brain is like a computer, and I have to free up RAM space. You know, delete the cookies every once in a while, otherwise it slows down. And it works like that. I feel like
a lot of corrupted files.
Yeah, I feel like I can pick and choose. Like, I don't need this memory anymore. As a world builder, and you know your world very well, what place, if you lived in this world, would you want to retire or live in your own world? And because you've uniquely read all of the stories in our anthology, whose world would you most likely want to live in out of the ones that you've gotten a glimpse of?
So out of my world, I'd probably want to retire in a city called Hellrose. And it's a city that is entirely built around art. So the entire city is playhouses and theaters and amphitheaters, and all of the streets are like everything that could possibly be decorative is, you know, there's murals painted on the walls that have more murals painted over them. And every street post is a individual sculpture. And it's a super beautiful city with a really seedy underbelly also. But just the kind of liveliness and vivacity of that city is definitely appealing as a place to go to. Yeah.
No place is perfect. So you can have like all the good stuff, but you still have to deal with the bad stuff too.
Yeah. As far as any world within the anthology, I mean, it all depends on the time period, because like K.R. Solberg's world, they have a little more technology, so you'd probably get some like plumbing and stuff, which would be nice. But also it's ruled by a bunch of like demonic immortal monsters that are super oppressive, so probably not that one.
I don't think about,
honestly, I know my own world well enough to say I would go to mine because I know where the safe little corners are. These other ones all got too much going on that I don't know where the safe spots are.
Yeah, I feel that. I would live with the fairies 1,000%. I'd be like, take me away from this pain, save my innocence. In real world, I definitely trade innocence for experience. As a writer, we have to.
Yep. Well, that's the thing with the world building idea is, so the queen of the fairies and her council aren't innocent.
Yeah.
You know, and the human guards who eventually build a city around the fairy city to protect it aren't.
Right.
And the idea behind that is, you know, somebody's got to give it up.
Someone has.
And the queen of fairies who makes all the innocent fairies, she can't have that innocent herself.
I mean, talk about siblings. The whole sibling dynamic of the eldest typically protects the youngest from a lot of that, and shields their innocence by not allowing them to experience all the trauma that they're going through with their parents and stuff. So I mean, that's very symbolic. It's very symbolic. Shocker. But no. Thank you for, again, letting me read your story in advance here. It was super great. Loved it. And getting a sense of your style and everything. Now I'm going to have to read your series because I got to know all the characters. But yeah, make sure, everybody, you need to get our book, get our anthology, you know? It's
Wonders and Dragons.
Wonders and Dragons.
Fantasy Sampler.
Yeah, when is it coming out? And it's pre-order.
Oh, it is. Yes, it's available for pre-order right now. It's releasing May 10th as far as like print copies and everything go. So yeah.
And a lot of us authors who do events and stuff will likely have it in person too. So if you see our names, make sure to stop by and you can get a signed copy.
I have a special page, like the second page in or whatever, where it's got 11 little signature spots for all the different authors, and then a 12th additional one, just in case you ever like run into the cover artist who's from another area of the country. So yeah, take it along with you to events in the Midwest, and you'll run across us to have it signed.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.